Hello, I'm Mark Ellen. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of conversations David Hepworth and I have had on this podcast we started 17 years ago. Some with ourselves, others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you enjoy them and want to support us and keep it all coming and get extra entertainment, including the weekly quiz and a special event on your birthday, visit patreon.com/wordinyour-ear or just like or subscribe in whatever way you prefer. Welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear. Dave and I feel we've been transported back to the offices of Word magazine, where the staff included for 6 years an old pal of ours, the great Kate Mossman, who's written an absolutely terrific series of profiles called Men of a Certain Age, My Encounters with Rock Royalty. Kate, it's lovely to see you again.
And you, hello, how are you doing?
We're doing fine. It was so nostalgic reading about the things that you mentioned about the office. I'd forgotten this. Remind people how we cut birthday cakes.
So the birthday cake was attempted with a pencil threaded through the middle of a CD, like a pizza wheel, that kind of thing. And then the plate was a press release.
The press was served up on a press release.
So because I was very kind of overwhelmed by working at the Word, and I did find myself in there a lot at the weekends on my own. And I don't know what I was doing because I wasn't working. I was kind of going to get things that I'd forgotten, but maybe there was something else going on. I kind of wanted to be there. I was a bit lonely and I wanted to be there because I liked the people in the office so much. So it was
because you lived in a crappy flat probably, and you
you lived in a crappy flat that was where I remember you used to do the washing up. You said in the bath. You just put all the plates in.
I put it all in and I put the hot tap on.
And it was only about 50 yards from the office, wasn't it?
But did you know that I'd already used the bath first when I did that?
No.
So it was my bath water that I would put there. It was quite clean. I washed twice a day in that flat.
Oh my Lord.
And it was only me eating off the dishes, so I didn't have to think about anyone else's microbes.
Well, we're very
because you were in Chapel Market, weren't you?
I was in Chapel Market.
Yeah,
and it was that period of life, I think, when you're young, sometimes the office, your colleagues become your family, and I was living by myself. And I remember feeling quite out of sorts at the weekend and then happy when I was back in the room.
You can't wait for Monday morning. That's right.
Yeah. Is that really sad?
No, not remotely sad.
I think it's not unusual at all. I think you find loads of people who used to work on smash hits, places like that, when they were just living in terrible flats.
Yeah.
And much preferred being in the office.
Yes.
They couldn't leave the office. They would stay there till midnight going, really working really hard. It's not true. They just they preferred that to being at home,
Yeah.
But one of the things that reminded me was that there was a kind of a long-running office gag that we used to have where people would say, what's the greatest record ever made?
Yeah.
As if and everyone would go, I know this
Yeah.
one. As if there was only one right answer. I remember very early on from when you arrived in the office, which must have been about, 2007, 2008 or whatever, we'd say, what's the greatest record ever made? And you'd always say it was by Bruce Hornsby or Glenn Campbell or Jeff Beck or somebody. And we all thought, this is really extraordinary. This is somebody who's from the generation that grew up with Britpop, liking all these wrinkly old geezers. So why do you think you developed that particular taste?
I think I was raised with a sense that music in which you heard a lot of notes was music to be applauded, that there was something sophisticated about jazz rock, instrumental music, guitar music, and that kind of thing. So for me,
technique as well, wasn't it? And playing ability.
Yeah, and it wasn't showing off, and it wasn't wanking, as people like to say that a man playing a guitar solo is wanking. That's where they've basically been phased out now. And I just thought, because of my father's influence, I thought all that stuff was amazing. And I think, in retrospect, I was connecting with him through a lot of the music I was listening to, but it was my own as well. I mean, he had no interest in Queen or Bruce Hornsby or anything like that. So I was trying to find my own stuff, but it was sort of influenced by parental.
There's a bit in the intro when you say, how is it that in the presence of wrinkly rock stars twice my age, I sometimes think I'm meeting me? Explain that. That's really interesting.
It's a feeling of complete recognition, warmth, reciprocal ease that I get around older male musicians, which it's a very, very strange thing, but I instantly find myself being slightly more cheeky, more familiar, more playful, and then I end up getting a better interview. And if I'm with something about when I'm with a woman, and I'm interviewing, I feel like it's almost like I'm more respectful or something. I want her to like me. I'm not sure that she does. I'm kind of dealing with all these things about wanting to be trusted, wanting to be seen in the right way. Whereas with older men, it doesn't seem to happen. It just felt like an instant fit. It's like, oh, this is going to be fine. It's weird.
It's really interesting because I was thinking, flicking through your book, that. Doing more than flicking through.
I think you read it too, though, David.
Yeah, okay.
Well worth reading.
I was just reminded myself before we started, of all these encounters with all these people, and your encounters with Sting and so forth. And there's something about when male writers meet somebody like Sting, they kind of feel competitive with them.
Yes.
They just do.
Yeah.
Yes.
You can't fight it. You just do. And whereas you don't feel that.
No, not at all. And there was always a sense with the traditional music journalist. He was sort of almost the same age as the rock star who's interviewing. So he's showing them that he knows the back catalogue, that he understands where the career maybe went wrong, this kind of thing. And I felt that maybe they were expecting a guy like that to turn up, and there was a palpable relief when it was.
They must have been so thrilled. Somebody young, somebody without all that luggage.
Yeah. And then
not judging them,
In my favour, what happened was often they would then open up a lot more because they thought they were kind of quote unquote safe because it was just a pretty gay lady, that kind of thing. Nothing about here. So I think maybe that's why some of it was quite fruitful. But
right.
And also, I think male journalists tend to try and fit people into a kind of construct that they've invented. This is how I see Sting, and when I interview him, I want him to just conform to that pattern in my head. And
yes.
They're not looking for something that will surprise them or take them off in a different angle or whatever.
No, and
your attitude is totally unlike that, which is brilliant. You go in there and you ask people often about their backgrounds, about their parents, and build a sort of psychological portrait of who they actually are.
Yeah, well, I was interviewing Lynn Barber a few months ago, and she was saying, if you're fat as a teenager, like George Michael, for instance, you're always fat in your head. So you may be a megastar, but you're terribly anxious about that photo shoot because you're still the fat 14-year-old from East Finchley or whatever. And I think that idea of going back to people's childhoods, people think it's the artist thinks it's kind of safe territory because, we could talk about mum and dad and my brother and all that kind of thing. But actually, it's very revealing. And a lot of rock journalists maybe wouldn't necessarily go back to the childhood because how is that relevant to the career in music?
It's the most relevant thing, isn't it?
Yeah, completely. It reveals everything. So I like to go there and talk about mums and dads and all that kind of stuff.
Because that Sting chapter particularly, I think it's so interesting. Sting's mum was a hairdresser, his dad was a milkman and a fitter at the engineering works. Sting helped on the milk rounds. When you compare that with Stuart Copeland coming from this kind of aristocratic family, wasn't it? His father in the kind of CIA. You kind of think, it's astonishing that these people ever managed to coexist, really. They were so different.
Yeah, and it explains a lot about Sting's popularity in America because it's such an American story, a self-made story, and he's not... Yeah. He's never been treated with the same derision in the States as he has here, and it was so interesting with him because I really wanted to do an interview with him that didn't take the piss. But I found him, he was one of the few people that I found almost impenetrable, maybe because Shaggy was with him. So he was doing a combined interview with Shaggy. But also I think he's just distrustful of the way he used to reveal his influences and his intellectual interests in his 30s to journalists. And it all backfired terribly with this kind of wall of pretentious wank.
Yeah, they said he's pretentious because he'd read Solzhenitsyn or it was.
Yeah.
I know.
So if you start to ask him about that stuff now, he gets very, he just kind of looked at me with a scowl and I thought, this is a failure.
Another thing Dave and I we were just talking about it actually, noticed about the book, another pattern was that your tastes are wonderfully original. they're not. You don't tend to write about kind of the critically revered people. You know, Bruce Hornsby, who we must get onto later. You know, Queen.
Yeah.
You know, these are Kiss, Tom Jones. These are kind of unfashionable people.
Yeah.
So you weren't swayed, obviously, by the kind of consensus of the music press when you were younger.
I think maybe it gave me more. I need the freedom to get enthusiastic and interested in somebody that nobody else is. I don't know where it comes from, but it goes right back to adolescence with, you know, when I was into Queen, you would not talk about Queen. They were so unfashionable in the 90s that it was almost a shameful thing. But it gave me this great breadth of a scope for the obsession that was it was all mine, and I could really go into it without the collective. And that's why I hated Britpop, because I thought, well, I'm being told to like this, and it's a tribe, and it's sort of, I don't know, it alienated me somehow. So I needed to find, and it's always been the same, like Bruce Hornsby or Glenn Campbell. They've just kind of found me, and then I've gone into this world for a few months, which fortunately managed to make a career out of. But for a long time in my adolescence, it was just like the only thing that occupied my mind. It was really strange.
But the Queen, just tell us briefly about that. You've actually made a television program about your obsession with Queen, which started, I think, when you were about 11. And the interesting thing was that it started pretty much exactly the moment Freddie Mercury had died, and therefore the group didn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So, firstly, why start then, and what was it about Queen that was so fascinating?
Well, that might be part of the same thing of this feeling of having just missed the boat. There was a lot of longing bound up in that. There was a lot of wistfulness and a lot of yearning for another age, which, of course, if you're into that music anyway, you're already yearning for another age to an extent because you're listening to records from the 70s. And there was something very powerful for me about the fact that I just missed him and he was gone. He died days before, and I pulled the newspaper out of the bin because I recognised him on the front pages of the Norfolk Eastern Daily Press. And I didn't know what AIDS was, and it all kind of, I think it was just very compelling. It was bound up in lots of adult things like sex and death and AIDS and all that kind of thing. And then I discovered this band that kind of kept me going for most of a decade because there was so much music and it was in so many different styles. So it was like a cartoon band, really, with four very, very different people. It wasn't just a kind of tortured artist with a guitar of one sort of mindset and one mood that occupied me for all those years.
And also they weren't cynical, were they? Because you had this thing about how much you hated the 90s and the cynicism of the 90s growing up at that time, which I'd never thought of because obviously I didn't grow up at that time, you know.
Yeah.
And Queen as a kind of alternative, kind of cynical Britpop was an attractive thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, they described themselves as fun ambassadors once.
Yeah.
They were apolitical, although obviously have got into trouble for many years for playing Sun City and things like that. Oh, we're so apolitical, we're playing Sun City. But they just had this kind of vibe that it sort of hung outside of politics, outside of contemporary discussion. It was kind of larger than life. And then Britpop had this very powerful irony, like a force field around it, which maybe if you're an adult at the time was less difficult to deal with because the YBAs were making ironic art. It was kind of all part of the pose. But there was something about being a teenager at that point that I found very difficult to handle because you weren't really allowed to say that you liked anything. Even if you loved Oasis, you didn't say you loved Oasis. Yeah. But it just felt kind of like a kind of quite a cold culture to grow up in. And so I wanted something warmer and more colourful somehow.
You said the 90s, the expression of the 90s, the temperature of the 90s could be measured by the expression on Mark Lamar's face. I think it's just so brilliant. You just think of Mark Lamar's face, and that somehow that's the ironic, cynical 90s to you. Yeah,
it was so sneering and so over it, you know. It was just like, and yet the dominant sound was very brash. It was like a powerful, you know, the way the decade is talked about now is, you know, the last gasp of rock music, but it was like they were so over it. I just thought, I just hated that feeling about it.
So what was your first experience of interviewing one of your idols?
One of my idols, what would that have been? I mean, an idol would have been Roger Taylor, but my first interview was actually for you. So that was not my first interview, but my first interview of an old rock star was Kevin Ayers.
Right.
So that was 2008.
which is fascinating to reread that, because I mean, was part of your interest in him that he was just such an unreconstructed 70s classic rock star?
I think it was you that you thought that it would be interesting for me to do it rather than a male rock critic, because you knew that he was a hero among male rock critics.
Yeah.
And there was this sense of this kind of Edward Learyan, the Soft Machines, Syd Barrett, kind of like this wonderful person who was very beautiful and a massive trumpeter and wrote this poetry. And if you sensed someone who'd been following his career, then you would get that piece regardless of what you actually found.
Oh, it was my idea. Maybe it was.
It was your idea, definitely, because I didn't know who he was. I didn't know who he was.
Right.
This is classic.
That's great. Yeah. I just thought you'd be interested in him.
That's the first time I've heard the expression crumpeteer in years.
Crumpeteer. Well, I remember you going off and saying, look, do you want to, but let me warn you, he is a massive, he probably still is, a massive crumpeteer. So be very careful.
Yeah. And so I got to grips with his back catalogue. I did all my research, and then I got there and I found a very broken person who was nothing like the kind of old roue of legend. But I do wonder, maybe if a male music journalist of his own age had gone, maybe they still would have written that piece as though he was, inhabiting his full Kevin Ayersian self. Whereas because I didn't know what I was going to get, I just had to describe what I saw, and it was upsetting. It was
a slightly broken down old guy in a kind of hammock, just chain smoking and drinking bottles of red, wasn't it?
Yeah,
really?
Well, massive alcoholic. He drank a pint of neat Pernod in front of me in 10 minutes.
Oh my God.
He drank 3 bottles of white wine, and then I got into a car with him and drove down a mountainside, and I remember thinking, I'm just hoping he was driving. He was
he had a pint of Pernod.
At the end of the drive, he stopped out and got a swift pint of Pernod in a bar. So he had to top himself up from the wine he'd had at the top of the mountain. And I remember thinking, he's such a gentleman, he's not going to crash this car. He won't. And the car swerved and somebody was like waving their hand out the window. So I remember thinking, like, I hope I make it out of this alive. But it was more, he's so vulnerable. When we sat in a bar, he wanted to sit where the sun was not on his face because he didn't want to be seen. And yet he was still sort of vibing on this like young woman, older man dynamic and telling me all these things. And then he expected me to like go back after the interview and sleep in his house with him, which I didn't put in the piece, but I had to kind of explain that, that was not going to happen, which was kind of a funny ending to it.
God, no, I can remember you. I remember ringing you and you telling me all that, and me feeling kind of alarmed and parental and going, oh my God, what have I done? This is disastrous. Oh.
Is there an instant when you meet people, and this book is all encounters with rock royalty, as you say in the subtitle, where you go into the room and you see them for the first time, and there is really powerful information in those first 10 seconds. Do you find this?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting with John Bon Jovi because he was so different from how I imagined he was going to be. I thought he was like the Bill Clinton of rock. Like, he's always on a certain mode. He's very smooth. He's very cheerful, big flashy teeth. And he walked in his sunglasses and he was sighing. And I thought, wow, I'm going to get a completely different interview to anything I've ever seen with John Bon Jovi. And I don't know why he decided to do that day, but he was in a terrible mood. And it was great fun because there was actually something to work with. So it was, that first impression. And Gene Simmons was sitting with no makeup on in the hotel lobby with his hair, which is like wire wool, scraped up into a top knot. And it reminded me of, he once described himself as looking at best like a baby dog at birth. God. That was his description of his own face. And he was like, it just kind of made me think about how different he looked without that black and white transformation. But he wanted to be seen like that at first, which was interesting.
Do you think that's a kind of female thing to notice those? It's interesting. I'm reading Hilary Mantel somewhere in Wolf Hall. She describes Anne Boleyn raking the women head to toe. Is the idea that, and I've got my granddaughters can do this. If they meet a woman, they've taken in all the information.
Yeah.
Wow.
And 2 years later, they say she was wearing red shoes or whatever.
Oh my God,
They'll remember. And your description of Gene Simmons with his hair like wire wool.
Yeah.
A male would never wouldn't notice that.
No, that's true. There's not much physical description from men to men because there's something they think it's a bit homoerotic.
I think it's
they do. They're self-conscious and embarrassed about it.
Yeah, it's insane.
They think it's a bit camp to be noticing things like that in the first place.
That's ridiculous. And I see so many long form interviews that have no physical description.
Yeah, or just very boring stuff about, brown socks or whatever.
Yeah.
But there's something I was looking at in your book today where you said that he has, and I can't remember who it was, he says he has anthropoid legs like Mick Jagger. I can't remember who you...
Yes. Yeah, the tiny little wiry tight little legs. There's a look that Jeff Beck described. Jeff Beck explained why all these men had the keyhole face. He said it was bad dentistry and a teenage predilection for sweets.
Yeah.
So what? The cheeks kind of collapse inwards.
Yes.
Do you mean the egg timer face, isn't it?
The egg timer face. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
So Jeff Beck was able, because he was he was so brilliant at standing outside the rock cartoon and kind of amping it up, that he could explain why, like, he and Ronnie Wood had the same face shape.
That's brilliant.
It's extraordinary because Jeff Beck, who's one of your heroes, didn't change his appearance from the age of 18 till his dying day, did he?
No. And they must all have the same hair weave or plugger.
His face got older and his hair's like Mick Jagger. His hair stayed the same age.
Yeah.
And there may be a weave. It got thicker and thicker, didn't it?
Thicker and thicker.
And
sometimes
a proceeding hairline. That's right.
Yeah. It's like a slightly purple tinge to it sometimes.
Yes.
Very feathered. Yeah. I mean, they must all they go to the same suit maker. What's his name? Somewhere in Piccadilly, there's a guy who makes all those clothes that the old rock stars wear.
Oh, Cordings, is that place?
Oh, what's his name?
Oh, I can't remember.
Can't remember. Anyway, and then they must also go to the same hair plugger because they've all got hair. Like nobody's lost their hair.
Well, there are exceptions. Pete Townsend, James Taylor, but yes, they are exceptions.
Yeah. Very few.
We've all seen their hair recede and we've seen their hair come back.
Yes.
Magically. How that possibly happened, we do not know.
We should ask you about, just so many interesting people that you picked on. And one was as Paul O'Neill of the Trans-Siberian Orchestra.
Yeah.
Now, I thought that was really interesting because you have to explain very briefly for anyone listening who don't know who they are, who the TSO were and why you became interested in him, because that's a journalistic story, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. They came to me, which was strange. I thought, why are they coming to the New Statesman? Why? Yeah. They are the first rock and roll franchise. Like they're a band that plays Christmas music through heavy metal instruments to Middle America.
Yeah.
So they do things like Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy and various things like that with a beat, and all very kind of high camp. And they're a band that's split into two halves. So you've got one half that goes up and down the West Coast and one half that goes up and down the East Coast in the winter season, rakes in all this Christmas money and then takes a few months off. Paul O'Neill used to be a roadie for Aerosmith or something insane. Like, he's from the Steven Tyler generation.
He was a guitarist in Jesus Christ Superstar or something.
Yes, and he was not obviously musical, but he was a producer. He couldn't sing a note, couldn't really play, but he'd masterminded this thing because he had a genuine concern about who's going to be playing rock music in 200 years' time, the way people play Beethoven in orchestras. Like, how is the legacy of this going to continue? And this was obviously before, like, the Avatar shows and stuff. This was just before the holograms had really sort of taken off with the ABBA thing. And I think he came to the New Statesman because he wanted like a serious think piece about the future of rock and roll and his insane band. But he died a year later in the same hotel that he put me up in. And I think he knew that was going to happen, shall we say. And so he was kind of shoring up his legacy. But, yeah, he was The
piece starts with him, what he called whacking.
Yeah.
Where he would go up, I think maybe it was with his daughter actually, and give homeless people on the streets $50,000 in cash.
Yeah.
Because he was that wealthy, you know. I remember looking at that first and thinking, well, that's an interesting story. And then started to think, that's a terrible thing to do.
Terrible thing to do.
I mean, how is that going to make their life any better? It could only make it worse.
I mean,
it's all about him.
Yeah, it was one of the things that made him charming and awful at the same time, was he was completely naive, and he lived in this sort of Dickensian world where you just have to kind of come into some money and everything's going to be okay. He was like one of those weird philosophers from like 1980s Christmas movies where it's like a tramp that turns into a magic, you know, a prince or something like that.
Yeah.
All his songs were about that. They were all about all you need is a bit of cash and a bit of generosity and a handout. And it was basically the American dream. And he had a vast collection, a huge safe full of priceless artifacts, including like a Fabergé egg and letters from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and stuff like that. And he was just
a Fabergé egg that had been sent to the moon or something.
It contained a 50
pages
pages
of the King James Bible.
King James Bible, and it had gone up in the Apollo
incredibly
14 mission.
Yeah.
So he was trying to be one of the great sort of rock and roll stars, but he also wasn't a household name, certainly in Europe. But he was an amazing character, and it was very sad that he passed away. But yeah, it was. I don't know what the future of that band is, but for a while they were extremely big in America and part of like the Christmas season. You know.
Yeah. Well, it proved your theory that there is a great story about everybody if you're prepared to look for it. You know.
Yeah.
Tell us about Shaun Ryder. How was your encounter with Shaun Ryder?
Shaun Ryder was brilliant because he was one of those people that would be like, he'd be a good copy on a text message. He's just completely in character all the time. And he seemed to be enjoying the interview, and he was sort of giving little kind of grunts and very, very engaged and really listening to my questions, which surprised me because I thought he'd be so sort of blasted by years of drug abuse that he'd be all over the place. But I think people like that, they're so professional, a bit like Johnny Rotten. They were the same kind of person to talk to. They're always on, they always deliver, and they know how to kind of make it sound
they're characters, aren't they?
Just characters, yeah.
It's Dame Edna, isn't it?
Basically. Yeah, totally. And probably terrible people behind closed doors, but like what you get in the interview is exactly what you hope. So it's not necessarily an interview where you dig much, but you just all these jewels are coming out in their weirdness. And the very first thing he said to me was, he said he hasn't got any pubes at the moment because he's been taking testosterone supplements. It's like, why have you said that on an opening gambit?
Is this Shaun you're talking about?
Shaun Ryder, yeah.
That's
all
hilarious.
his hair had fallen out.
Yeah.
And so he had no eyebrows, no hair, and apparently no pubes either.
I will never be able to think of him any other way, really. Now. It's the first thing that will spring to mind. God.
So who is it? Who would you like to interview that you weren't able to?
I've never had Elton John. I've never got McCartney or Jagger. There's this kind of level that it's hard for me to get that kind of access to, and it would be something short if it ever did happen. But yeah, I feel like I mean, you must have both interviewed Elton John.
Well, I've interviewed Elton John, and the brilliant thing about Elton John is that anybody who's had any kind of therapy for, in his case, alcohol and drug addiction, are conditioned to be honest. So when you ask them a question, they will answer you absolutely. There's no deception at all. They will tell you precisely the truth. And that's really interesting and really good copy.
Yeah, I think the same is maybe true for anybody who's been through near-death experiences, like the Ryder kind of mold. Anybody whose body has been pickled by drugs over the years, they just don't care. They know that's part of their appeal.
It's very interesting because it kind of changed the nature. Because it's interesting, your McCartney and Jagger won't have had it. That's my guess. Okay.
No.
And therefore, you will not get any of that. Whereas I remember this, the early 90s. I was in Los Angeles interviewing Bruce Springsteen, and Mark Cooper, who we all know, was there, producer, editor of The Late Show, whatever. And Mark said to me at one stage, ask him if he's had therapy. And so I did. And he said, well, yeah.
Yeah.
And Mark said to me, well, they've all had therapy now. And that was the point at which they all had started having therapy. And the only exceptions will be Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney.
Yes, completely. I could not imagine
Joni Mitchell won't have had therapy. I'll leave it but
we must ask you about the Joni Mitchell.
Nearly everybody else will have done.
Yeah.
I feel like Joni Mitchell tried to give herself her own therapy in 1973 and then decided that, she didn't need it or something like that.
I see she's back in the news again this week. Have you noticed? Joni
Why?
Mitchell. Oh, unfailingly. It's I was looking at this album cover not long ago, which is, of course, Don Juan's Reckless Daughter, where she's depicted in blackface.
Yes.
And so now that's come back. How could you, Joni?
Has it come out?
Oh, yeah, it's all over the place. People's going, I've gone off her now. Crying out loud.
Yeah.
Of all the things.
She performed like that too sometimes.
Yes, she did.
And
she has a very convincing explanation. She said, I identified so much with black men, I wanted to be one.
It's such a shame, isn't it? Because I hope that had just remained under the radar because she's so venerated, and it's like, oh no, it's come out.
But if you take the kind of naughtiness out of Joni Mitchell, what are you left with, for goodness sake? That's the interesting thing about Joni Mitchell.
Flintiness and that originality.
It is.
And the fact that she just doesn't care a lot of the time. She doesn't care. She literally didn't used to care what people thought of it. If she had, she would have carried on making, Blue for the 14th time.
Yes.
She just went off at any angle she wanted to. But we must ask you about the chapter about Cary Raditz, because that's an amazing thing. Carrie, everyone will know that song by Joni Mitchell. Carrie, get out your cane, etc. You're a mean old daddy, and you tracked him down and interviewed him. So, it was a brilliant piece. What did you discover about her from talking to him?
I discovered that she needed protection in that period because she had just released Ladies of the Canyon. Weirdly enough, she was allowed to go off on her Greek Odyssey in the middle of the press period for Ladies of the Canyon. I can't work this out, but Carrie was like, no, apparently that's the dates. I don't understand it either. So she went off to Metella and how do you pronounce it? Matala. And she was already being followed by an entourage at that point. People had got wind that she was on the up and that she was something special. And she didn't particularly like the fact that there was a pack of people around her, a pack of tourists. And Carrie was a very rough, tough character who cooked in the Mermaid Cafe. And he became a kind of bodyguard / boyfriend. And she shared the cave with Carrie for 3 months. So he was only, I think, 23 years old. He was he was like a stooge figure in her life, and also a close friend, and also a lover. So an odd one, really. I don't think it was like one of the big love affairs of her life, but she definitely needed him.
You can see why she needed him, because, just to keep away this constant attention from the outside world,
Yeah.
And that explains a lot about famous people's relationships, I think. It's protection, isn't it?
And one of the intriguing things that obviously doesn't come out of either that or California that he's also mentioning, because he's the redneck on the Grecian Isle who takes her camera, was that he actually went back to LA with her and lived in Laurel Canyon a few months later. So she liked him enough to send him a one-way plane ticket, and he went over to try and live with her, and it just went terribly wrong. She was already performing with and whatever else with James Taylor by that point. And he said he felt like this kind of gorilla that had been brought from the zoo, sitting there on a sofa with all these kind of refined Graham Nash types coming in. I mean, he was from a very posh, like antebellum family, but he was just kind of slightly dysfunctional, I think, and slightly crazed, and he didn't fit in. So it's amazing because he's been living under that song for his entire life. He's 79 now. There were years and years where he pretended it wasn't about him. Yeah, he didn't want people to know. But he does still feed off it as well. He can't quite escape the...
Well, as she said, songs are like tattoos.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. They stick there forever. One question. Having interviewed loads of rock stars, have you come to the conclusion that they're just like you and me, or have you come to the conclusion that they've got something missing, or they're just different?
I think they're different. I think I would see a formula of vulnerability, giant ego, and just a sense of oddness. There's an oddness about it. And I think this sense, obviously, that you're frozen, particularly at a certain age when you become famous. There's parts of your early adulthood that usually people go through in their 20s when they kind of develop into adults that maybe didn't quite happen in time. And an obsessional interest in music for some of them, which excludes other areas of like human development, possibly. And I like it when they can't quite accept that their career's on the wane. I think that's really, really interesting. When you meet people it's great to meet people who don't care about anything, they've got nothing to prove, but I like it when they're still sort of holding on to the idea that their new record might be as important as the one that they released in 1974.
Which you have to, really, because you have to have that self-belief to keep going. I mean, It's easy for us to look at it from the outside and say, that's not as good as their third album, but they've got to believe that it's worth carrying on.
Yeah, they wouldn't get an interview if they said, well, I'm not as interested in music as I used to be.
or if they said, this is my new record, it's not great, to be honest.
Yeah.
I've done better work.
The best people that I've interviewed were like that about their new music. So my Terence Trent D'Arby interview, he found it unbearable to listen to his new records. He had to leave the house when his children wanted to hear them, and yet he was still making them. And to me, that is the most interesting psychological phenomenon there. Someone's in such a state about losing their fame as it was that they're still making records, but they can't even bear to talk about them. He didn't want to talk about his new album.
Well, here's that chapter, the piece you wrote about him is really moving, I think, because he's just sort of never quite recovered from the fact that he produced his first album, introducing the hard line, and it was worldwide success. Then the second album, he was given complete autonomy, wasn't he? He chose the material, he chose the name of the album, and he chose the artwork, and it really did very, very well, pretty terribly, you know.
It sold, I think the first record sold 100 million copies in 3 days. And then the second one, sold 300,000. And that was it. But he was a story in plain sight because these emails kept coming saying, oh, the new release from Sananda Maitreya. This was in the last 10 years.
He changed his name, that's right.
And then, you'd look through and they'd sort of admitted that it was Terence Trent D'Arby. And I got the interview on the condition that I didn't mention Terence Trent D'Arby to Terence Trent D'Arby. So, of course, I did straight away. And he looked excited. So I thought, this is perfect. This is going to be a viral hit.
Don't you think it's interesting? Again, this is a conversation Dave and I have had a lot, and we had with John Harris, actually, when we were talking to him last week about his book, about how everyone expects that just because performers can write songs and they can perform and they're electrifying on stage, that you automatically assume they're going to be real kind of extroverts and really good, socially integrated. And it's so often not the case. And it's kind of wrong of us to expect that they should be.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, completely. And also, not everybody should know how to talk about what they do and have a good hindsight on their career just because they happen to have lived it. So it depends whether you get somebody who can really stand outside the phenomenon of rock and roll and fame, or whether they're still completely bound up in it. And sometimes the latter are the more interesting, really, I think.
Jeff Beck, I just one question about him. Did you feel that he was a classic example of self-sabotage? I kind of look at Jeff Beck and you think, here's a guy who he could have been so much more successful, but obviously it was part of him that just either didn't want that or didn't think he was capable of dealing with it. I don't know.
I think maybe the latter. I think maybe he had a lot of complexities, psychological complexities that we don't know and that have never come to light. There was just something about him. I don't know. I found him. He lived with his wife and many, many dogs in a Tudor mansion. He'd never had any children. He had 40 vintage automobiles that he lay underneath and tinkered with the engines, and he tinkered with his guitar. And it's like he probably had a very complicated psychological profile, but because he was also a rock cartoon, he never needed to show it, so it kind of protected him a little bit. I'd love to have really known who Jeff Beck was, and maybe no one ever will now. It's really weird that Jeff Beck's funeral was only attended by his wife and Johnny Depp. His interment, sorry. The funeral was well attended, but it was all very kind of, it's a strange story.
Just his wife and Johnny Depp.
The actual burial, Johnny Depp and his wife, and then the funeral was full of his sort of rock and roll friends. But yeah, there was something very private about him. And he kind of exaggerated this idea of not being able to go and sit in the same room as Pat Metheny because Metheny was so much of a better guitarist. But you wonder if there was any truth in that sense of competition and needing to be in his own little world in order to express himself properly.
Oh, God. How have things changed over the time you've been doing interviews? Because so much of your interviews is just about access. It's about having a huge amount of time with people, and access just gets more and more reduced, doesn't it? Plus,
Yeah.
you make the point about doing an interview, I think, with Tom Jones on Zoom, and how impossible it is on Zoom to pick up the characteristics and, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I was still lucky enough to do a couple of 1970s style interviews where you would go away, kiss in Moscow, and then that funny guy we were talking about from Trans-Siberian Orchestra in Florida, and they were sort of 4 or 5 day trips with lots of access. But yeah, it's totally different now. And there is, since the pandemic, there's an expectation that Zoom will be absolutely fine. And actually, Zoom would be fine with someone like Tom Jones, Sean Ryder, or Johnny Rotten, because as long as the cartoon is on the screen,
Yes.
it can perform as if it's on television.
Yeah.
And you're just a member of a TV audience, and it's absolutely fine. But I think it's about time, isn't it? You need, and I find this with politicians that I interview, the most valuable hours are the hours following them around their constituency, rather than sitting down in a room. And if you think that all you get is that 45 minutes in a room, it kind of makes a mockery of the whole business.
It comes back to, the theory we always used to talk about at Word, that the thing you want to do with rock stars is not even listen to them talk. You want to watch them behave.
Yes. And the way
behaving is the thing. You can see them singing. Everybody do that. You want to see how they walk down the corridor. Yeah. How do they interact with other people? How they get in a car? How are they with other people? You want to look at their shoes.
Yes.
It's all that stuff.
How do they talk to their driver? How do they, that kind of thing.
I always used to find when you were interviewing somebody and occasionally their mobile would go off and they'd answer a phone. So I've got to take this very briefly. And they'd ask and they'd be a completely different person in that 15 or 20 seconds. Well, tell them that's absolute rubbish and I'll absolutely nothing to do with it at all. And I hear from them again, I'll be furious. Or whatever. Anyway, where were we? Yes, the third album. You're thinking, I'm seeing a little window into another side of their character here. But I think Dave's absolutely right. And we used to talk about this a lot at the magazine. You just want to sit and notice the details.
You just want to look at them. You want to look at them.
It reminds me, actually, I was reading about Lady Gaga recently, and so you did her for Elle, didn't you, Mark?
Yeah.
And then Elle have done her again. They did her in January. And it just shows how much things have changed in that 10 years or whatever, because the piece is written by a super fan. There is no sense of what Lady Gaga's talking about. The abstractions that she talks about are not penetrated or examined at all. And it includes like a phoner with Lady Gaga's venture capitalist fiance, where the fan talks about how great Lady Gaga is and how lucky, he says I'm lucky to be with her and that kind of thing. And I'm thinking that's just a decade where the pop stars have won the press in that she can presumably select someone to do that interview. It's not the editor anymore. I mean, I was up to interview Janelle Monáe a couple of years ago, and Janelle vetoed me because I wasn't black and queer.
Well,
keep working on it.
I know, yeah. But this is just so much the case. I mean, not that necessarily happened in the case of Elle, but it's just the idea that you either want Lady Gaga on the cover on her own terms, or you're not going to get her at all.
Exactly.
So you'd rather have her on the cover than not have her. So you finish up agreeing to probably, who knows, probably even copy approval. I know. We were very lucky that we worked at a time when none of that seemed to matter quite as much. And you carried on working on those kind of really independent pieces. They're brilliant. Yeah. Okay, it's so nice to talk to you.
You too.
Very good. Very good.
Well, it's
a fantastic book, isn't it, Dave? We thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Men of a Certain Age, My Encounters with Rock Royalty. And it's an absolute delight to talk to you again.
Thank you. Lovely to see you.
Good luck with it all.